2 years had passed after Thomas almost got executed by the hitmen who were ordered by Chester. 2 years ago, Thomas Shelby said that he wanted to get married soon. Finally, the wedding day of Thomas and a woman whom he loved had come. The members of Peaky Blinders and the members of the bride's families who came from the group of cavalries gathered in a church to attend the wedding of Thomas and his bride. Not long after that, the bride who had been waited by everybody finally arrived in the church. Apparently, the beautiful woman who was lucky to be the wife of Thomas Shelby was Grace. The existence of Thomas and Grace's son called Charles had softened Thomas's heart that he decided to change his marital status. Thomas Shelby was known as a successful businessman back then. Because of his successful business, he could afford to live in a beautiful mansion. After Thomas and Grace exchanged their wedding vows, everybody in the church went to Thomas's mansion to enjoy the wedding party. At first, everything went well, but suddenly, Thomas Shelby faced an urgent situation. Even on his wedding day, Thomas still had many business problems that he needed to solve and some meetings that he needed to attend soon. On his wedding day, Thomas noticed some people who weren't invited as his guests came to his wedding ceremony and mingled with other invited guests there. After Thomas saw them, he told all members of Peaky Blinders to come to the kitchen. Thomas told them that it was his and Grace's glorious day, so he asked them not to make any scene on that day. If there was any problem, he told them to solve that problem as quietly as possible that nobody could ever notice. There was something different about Arthur this time. Arthur had married a beautiful woman called Linda. Because of Linda, Arthur slowly began to leave his dirty world. He had even become a better person who could control his anger. After that, everybody gathered in the dining room to have a dinner. There was a Russian gangster who joined the dinner. He approached Aunt Polly and talked to her. He asked Aunt Polly to help him talk to Thomas. After the Russian gangster met Thomas, Thomas asked the Russian gangster to give him all money that he had promised. The amount of that money was $10,000. The Russian gangster said that those money would be given by the niece of the Duke who would come from London. Grace suspected that something dangerous was happening there, so she asked Aunt Polly to confirm whether her suspicion was right or not. Aunt Polly told her that Russian people had bought some weapons that they would use to fight the Bolsheviks in Georgia, and Churchill was the middleman in that trade. Grace believed that it was what had been bothering Thomas's mind. After that, she asked Thomas to promise to leave his illegal businesses and live a normal life with his little family. Grace planned to establish a foundation. Meanwhile, she wanted Thomas to take care of horse tracks and car-selling businesses. Grace wanted them to do that because she wanted to protect their son Charles. A couple of times later, the police chief Moss escorted a woman who came from London. That woman carried the money that would be given to Thomas. She was the niece of the Duke and she was called the Grand Duchess Tatiana Petrovna. When Thomas asked her to give the money to him, Tatiana said that she was told to give those money to Mr. Kaldin. Thomas suspected that Kaldin was a secret agent from the embassy of the Soviet Union, so he wanted Tatiana to give those money to him instead. After Thomas received the money, Arthur began to worry because Peaky Blinders had got involved in a very serious problem. Thomas told him that he had to do this because they had no other options except playing the Churchill's game. Since Arthur had committed to become a better person, he instantly refused Thomas's request when Thomas asked him to kill people again. But after Thomas forced him into doing it, Arthur finally had to face Kaldin. Arthur and Kaldin got into a fight before Arthur finally managed to kill Kaldin. Nobody could hear the noise that came from Arthur's gunshot because Thomas had prepared everything to silence it. He had made sure that the invited guests were busy having fun in his party so none of them would realize that a murder had happened there. The next day, Thomas and the members of Peaky Blinders went to the base of Peaky Blinders to store all money that they had received. After that, Thomas went to a car manufacturing plant to meet a foreman. Thomas and that foreman had a conversation. Thomas said that he wanted to keep the key to the room number 6. As Thomas had expected, he found many secret tanks in that room. After that, Thomas came to meet a highly influential priest who had strong influences on the military, the parliamentarians, and the police. He said that he would organize a meeting between Thomas and a parliamentarian called Patrick Jarvis. Apparently, there were 27 main battle tanks in the room that had been checked by Thomas before. Those main battle tanks would be used in the battles in Georgia. It seemed like Thomas didn't really agree with the game that they were playing. Before that priest left that place, he gave Thomas an identity of a person who would be met by Thomas at the Ritz Hotel. That person was the uncle of Tatiana. He was called the Grand Duke Leon Romanov. At the same time, John and Arthur came to meet a gang leader called Shangretta. The gang leader said that he couldn't accept what Peaky Blinders had done to them. Apparently, Peaky Blinders had burned their restaurant because the gang leader's son was interested in Lizzie. Because of that problem, Aunt Polly told John to apologize to Shangretta. But unfortunately, John refused to apologize to Shangretta and said that he preferred if they destroyed the Shangretta's gang instead. Not long after that, Thomas arrived at the Ritz Hotel. Mr. Romanov was the person who had bought some weapons from Thomas, where Churchill played a role as the middleman for their trade. During that meeting, Mr. Romanov gave Thomas a blue sapphire stone as a bonus for him. As Thomas arrived at the base of Peaky Blinders, he received information that John had attacked Shangretta. Surprisingly, Thomas was proud with what John had done to Shangretta. Unlike Aunt Polly and Arthur, who began to show their soft sides, Thomas hoped that John would always be a savage member of Peaky Blinders who would attack instead of apologize to their enemy. When Thomas arrived at home, he presented Grace with the blue sapphire stone to make Grace happy. Thomas thought that it would be nice if Grace wore that beautiful blue sapphire stone in an event that would be held soon by Shelby Institute. Shangretta was being hospitalized for his eye's severe injury after John attacked him. Because of this, Shangretta's father was furious. He planned to take revenge on Peaky Blinders. The next day, some policemen raided the base of Peaky Blinders and arrested John and Thomas. At the prison, the priest came to Thomas's prison cell to meet Thomas. He told Thomas that if Thomas wanted to be released, then Thomas must obey everything he said because he was a highly influential person who had strong influence on the police. He also warned Thomas to think carefully before he took any action if Thomas didn't want to put his wife and his son in danger. To prove that he was serious with his words, that priest said that he had put something inside of Charles's toy. After Thomas heard that, he returned to home soon and checked his son's bed. He found a name card under Charles's doll. The event of Shelby Institute was being held in the evening. That evening, Grace looked stunning with her beautiful dress and the blue sapphire necklace that was given by Thomas. Grace was proud and happy to hold that event. Her lifelong dream that Shelby family owned a charity foundation finally came true. But Thomas didn't share the same happiness with Grace, especially after he saw the priest and Patrick attending that event. Then, the three of them went to another room to have discussion. They talked about the main battle tanks. Patrick and the priest told Thomas to order Tatiana to check all of those main battle tanks. After Thomas returned to the party, he sensed that there was a danger around them. He tried to ask Grace to leave that party, but it was too late. Suddenly a man came out of the crowd and shot Grace to death. For days, Thomas was grieving the death of a woman he deeply loved and cared for. Because of this, his family was afraid to just say hi to him or to talk about their business. That day, Aunt Polly and Michael came to Thomas's room to make a report about their business. They didn't talk a lot about their business because Thomas was still highly affected by the death of his wife. After they came out of Thomas's room, they met Arthur and John, who also wanted to meet Thomas to make a report about something. Aunt Polly had warned them not to go to Thomas's room because she was afraid that Thomas would be angry. But Arthur and John didn't listen to her and insisted on going to Thomas's room. Arthur and John told Thomas that they had found and killed the person who killed Grace. Apparently, that person was ordered by Shangretta's father to kill Grace. Before Shangretta managed to run away to New York, Thomas told Arthur and John to kill him. He also told them to kill Shangretta's wife, who would come with him to New York. When John and Arthur heard that, they refused Thomas's request right away because Shangretta's wife was their school teacher. Thomas didn't care about that. He kept forcing John and Arthur to kill Shangretta and his wife. John said that he was disappointed with Thomas because he thought that Thomas was underestimating him and Arthur. He thought that Thomas only saw them as his subordinates whom he could order as he pleased to do all his dangerous and dirty work. He was jealous with Aunt Polly and Michael, who were treated better and given more decent work. Thomas said that he did this because Michael had been appointed as the person who was responsible for the legal or official work since the beginning, and during this difficult situation, Thomas only prioritized those legal businesses. The next day, Thomas left his mansion and took Charles with him. They were accompanied by one of Thomas's subordinates called Johnny Dogs. Thomas came to meet a fortune teller called Madame Boswell. He gave the blue sapphire stone to her. He wanted to find out if that blue sapphire stone was a cursed stone which caused his wife to be murdered, or it had nothing to do with the death of his wife and his wife's death was merely caused by his carelessness. Every night, he had been haunted by his guilt because he had failed to protect Grace. Madame Boswell said that she indeed sensed a strong curse from that sapphire stone. But since Thomas had gotten rid of that sapphire stone, Madame Boswell said that Thomas would be blessed all over again. At the same time, Arthur and John went to check the main battle tanks in the factory. They had been assigned with this task by Thomas before Thomas left his mansion. After that, Arthur and John executed their mission to catch Shangretta and his wife at the harbor in Liverpool. Soon after they caught Shangretta and his wife, they released Shangretta's wife right away and told her to run away to New York soon. Then, they brought Shangretta to Thomas. Thomas had been suffered greatly that his anger and pain could be seen from his eyes. Because of that, he was really excited to kill Shangretta slowly with his own hands. Because Arthur didn't want Thomas to become more violent, he decided to shoot Shangretta right away to end his suffering. After that, Thomas asked Ada to find information about an informant called James. Thomas didn't want to waste his time, so he asked the police to catch and arrest James immediately. Apparently, James was a person who had leaked information about the robbery at a factory in Lancaster and Sparburg. He asked James to tell him the names of the people who were parts of organizations who had given him information. Those organizations include the Economic League, the Vigilance Committee, and the Odd Fellows. James warned Thomas that people who belonged to those organizations were extremely dangerous, but Thomas wasn't afraid of them because Peaky Blinders was also an extremely dangerous organization. At Arthur's house, Arthur received good news from his wife Linda Shelby. His wife told him that she was pregnant. Arthur was happy when he heard that news. Then, Linda asked Arthur to seriously leave his illegal businesses because she didn't want to end up like Grace. A few days later, Thomas attended an important meeting. Tatiana, Mr. Romanoff, Lady Isabella, the priest, and the others had been waiting for him in that meeting. Thomas brought the names of the informants which he had received from James. He gave those names to Lady Isabella. Thomas said that he planned to move all of the main battle tanks by using a train. Because the priest interrupted Thomas for many times, Thomas wrote a note and gave it to Lady Isabella. On that note, Thomas wrote that he had secrets. Before Thomas left that meeting, he told Tatiana that the priest was the person who had revealed the information about the robbery of the main battle tanks. That information was leaked to James and forwarded to the embassy of the Soviet Union. With the permission from Lady Isabella, Thomas planned to kill the priest. The next day, Thomas gathered all members of Peaky Blinders to talk about the robbery of the main battle tanks. The Duchess promised to reward them with £150,000, some jewelries, and sapphire stones for that robbery. Thomas planned to share those rewards with everyone who got involved in that robbery. He would also use the rest of the rewards to establish a legal business of Peaky Blinders. At the same time, Aunt Polly went to a church to make a confession. She asked God for forgiveness for murdering a policeman called Chester and the next murder of a priest that would be committed by Peaky Blinders. After Aunt Polly returned home, Linda asked Aunt Polly, Esme, and Lizzie to join a protest to defend labor rights for women with her. They marched in the streets with other female workers to demand justice. At the same time, Tatiana visited Thomas's house to ask Thomas to show her that the priest had really betrayed them. After Thomas showed her the proof, Tatiana left Thomas's house immediately. After that, Thomas told Arthur and John that the Duchess's family had a special room where they stored a treasure in their mansion. Thomas worried that the Duchess's family wouldn't pay them after they completed the mission of robbery, so he planned to steal the Duchess's family's jewelries for their payment if the Duchess's family didn't pay them. Apparently, the confession that Aunt Polly made a few days ago at the church was found out by the priest. Father Hughes had found out that Thomas was planning to kill him. The next day, Thomas executed his plan to kill Father Hughes. When he was following the priest to a toilet, suddenly he was attacked by someone from behind. Then, Thomas was brought by them to a place. In that place, Thomas was severely tortured until he became unconscious. He was also injected with a liquid and forced to apologize to the priest in front of the Duchess's family. If Thomas refused to apologize to the priest in front of the Duchess's family, then Father Hughes would hurt Thomas's family and son right away. After that, the severely injured Thomas was left by the priest in an empty street. Despite of his severe injury, he struggled to return home to finish his business regarding the robbery. Instead of getting a help soon for his severe injury, he decided to finish his business by canceling the mission of robbery first because he wanted to protect his family and son. Then, he attended a meeting in the Duchess's family's mansion and apologized to the priest in front of everybody who attended that meeting. After that, he attended a meeting with special counselors from the embassy of the Soviet Union. He told them that there would be a robbery of the main battle tanks in one of the factories in Birmingham. He said that his informant revealed this information in purpose so there would be a war in the Great Britain and the diplomatic relations between the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union would be ended. He also said that the robbery in Birmingham would be the trigger. Thomas told him everything because he didn't want the Soviet Union to blow up the train that they would use to move the tanks. If the Soviet Union blew up the train, then his family would be in danger. After that, Thomas finally asked Ada to bring him to the hospital. Thomas had endured great pain all this time because apparently his skull had been fractured. There was also heavy bleeding inside of his body. Because of that, he couldn't see anything except the face of his late father. For 3 months, Thomas had received an intensive treatment from the doctors in the hospital. He would be released from the hospital when he had fully recovered. Michael came to the hospital to talk to Thomas. He told Thomas that he had been knowing Father Hughes for a long time. Apparently, Michael had a personal grudge against Father Hughes for what he did in the past, so he asked Thomas to allow him to kill Father Hughes with his own hands. Arthur and the others came to the factory of the main battle tanks. They prepared some firing needles and used them to damage the weapons inside of the main battle tanks. Not long after that, a representative of the Soviet Union came and made an agreement where he and his team wouldn't blow up the train that they would use to move the tanks. As soon as Thomas returned home, he told Johnny Dogs that he was assigned to build a tunnel near the mansion of the Duchess's family. That tunnel would connect them to the special room where the Duchess's family stored their treasure. Therefore, they could steal the Duchess's family's treasure by using that tunnel. Not long after that, Thomas received a guest in his house. That guest was Alfie Solomons. The leader of the Jewish gang came to meet Thomas to offer a partnership with Thomas. After that, Thomas allowed Arthur and the others to come to that room. Arthur was surprised and mad when he saw Alfie there because Alfie Solomons had put him in a prison back then. Alfie Solomons regretted what he did to Arthur, so he apologized to Arthur. he said that he did that merely because of business. The next day, Thomas, John, and Arthur began their mission by investigating the special room that the Duchess's family used to store their treasure. When they went inside of the mansion of the Duchess's family, they were greeted by Tatiana and Lady Isabella. The mansion of the Duchess's family was heavily guarded by several security guards. After that, Thomas and the others entered a room where the Duchess's family treasure was stored. When they came there, they saw Alfie Solomons in that room. Alfie was assigned by Thomas to pretend to be a gemologist. Then, Thomas and the others were allowed by the Duchess to pick some jewelries that they want as their payment. After Thomas and the others observed the jewelries carefully, they decided to pick some jewelries which were equivalent to £7,000. A few days later, Thomas gathered his subordinates and assigned them to dig the tunnel with Johnny Dogs. He gave directions to them before they began to dig the tunnel. Inside of Michael's drawer, Aunt Polly found a bullet with the name of Hughes was written on it. Because of this, Aunt Polly was angry at Thomas. She warned Thomas that she would destroy Peaky Blinders if Michael used his gun to kill Father Hughes. The next day, the Shelby family took a photo in front of the Grace Shelby Institute, which was just inaugurated. Thomas planned to use that institute as the residential home for orphans. Thomas guaranteed that all orphans who lived there wouldn't be forced into doing labor or doing harmful or negative work. Unexpectedly, Father Hughes attended that inaugural event. He came there to remind Thomas that there were only 24 hours left for Thomas to do what he ordered him to do. Thomas had been busy talking to the guests that he didn't realize that his son had been kidnapped. It was obvious that Father Hughes was the one who had kidnapped Charles and took him as a hostage. When everybody found out that Charles was gone, they panicked and tried to look for him, but they couldn't find Charles anywhere. At night, Father Hughes finally told Thomas that he was the one who had kidnapped Charles. He kidnapped Charles because he had found out about the agreement that Thomas made with the Soviet Union. Because of that, the priest told Thomas to blow up the train. The priest threatened to kill Charles if Thomas refused to do that. The priest also said that he knew that Thomas had been digging a tunnel to steal the treasure of the Duchess's family. He told Thomas to give that treasure to him because he wanted to use it to establish his business. The priest said that he would return Charles to Thomas after Thomas had done everything he asked him to do. Thomas couldn't believe that Father Hughes found out about all of his plans. As long as he remembered, nobody knew about those plans except him and his family. Because of this, he was angry and accusing his family of betraying him. Thomas's state of mind was unstable that he failed to think clearly. He even came to meet Alfie Solomons and accused him of betraying him. Thomas and Alfie finally got into a fight. Suddenly Michael came to that place and killed Alfie Solomons' bodyguard. Fortunately, Michael managed to calm Thomas down. He told him that they needed to focus on the tasks that had been assigned by Father Hughes. After that, Thomas went straightly to the location of the tunnel construction. He was determined to finish digging that tunnel before midnight. He went inside of the tunnel and helped his subordinates to dig that tunnel. While they were digging that tunnel, suddenly a leakage occurred inside of that tunnel. Because it had a big risk, Thomas decided to blow up that tunnel by using a bomb. At the same time, Michael found Father Hughes. He was ready to kill him. In another place, Arthur was also ready to blow up the train. He decided to wait until 5 a.m. and planned to blow up the train after that if he didn't receive information that Charles was safe. At the same time, Thomas managed to steal the treasure of the Duchess's family, Michael managed to kill Father Hughes and save Charles, and Arthur managed to blow up the train. The next day, Thomas brought the Duchess's family's treasure that he had stolen to Tatiana. Apparently, Tatiana and Thomas had been working together secretly. Tatiana brought a person who would buy all of her family's jewelries with her. After Thomas received his money, he said goodbye to Tatiana. After that, Tatiana killed the person who had bought her family's jewelries right away. She did that so she could have his family's jewelries back, meanwhile Thomas could keep his money. After that, Thomas gathered his family to pay them because they had contributed to make their mission become successful. Each of them was paid well. Arthur and John planned to use the money that they received to start a new life. But when they were about to say goodbye to Thomas, Thomas told them that the police had issued an arrest warrant to arrest Arthur, John, Aunt Polly, and Michael. Not long after that, the policemen arrived and arrested Arthur and the others.